One of the few North American air shows with a double headliner of two military jet aerobatic teams. The California International Airshow 2023 starred the Thunderbirds and the Snowbirds, the latter taking part in their final airshow of the season. Hello, welcome to the California International Airshow in Salinas, our final Airshow Dispatches episode this year. Why are we here, you may ask? Well, this is part of my personal mission to see all three of the North American military jet aerobatic teams in a single weekend. Here in Salinas we've got the Thunderbirds and the Snowbirds, but let's take a look at the rest of the lineup and running order. It's definitely a much smaller lineup than we'd expect from any airshow back in Europe. We'll start with the US Navy F-35C performing a solo display and legacy flight, then the Red Bull Air Force with the Edge 540 and Bow 105. Following that, a Hercules flypast and several civilian performances. The Snowbirds are at 18 minutes, then we have Kent Pietsch, one of his last airshows before retiring, and the Thunderbirds are in half an hour's time. But it is the US Navy that kicks things off, an F-35C from VFA 125. We've seen multiple F-35As and Bs already this series. How does the C model differ? Well, this is the traditional carrier-capable version, which operates using catapults and arrestor wires. To facilitate that, it has two nose-wheel tyres rather than one, with strengthened landing gear and fuselage components to take the stress of those repeated carrier landings. It also has a bigger wingspan and larger control surfaces for improved low-speed handling while on final approach. That in itself is a compromise because those larger wings would take up valuable space on a carrier deck. So to shrink the aircraft's footprint and allow more of them to be based aboard any one carrier, Lockheed Martin added foldable wingtip sections. That introduced a structural weakness in the aircraft, which means it has to be limited to 7.5 G rather than the usual 9 G. But the larger wing area means that even with the lower G limit, the F-35C still has similar turn performance to the F-35A and B. The US Navy is the only operator of the F-35C. Operational capability was achieved in 2019 and the first deployment occurred in 2021. The US Navy will operate a total of 273 F-35s when deliveries are complete. VFA 125 is what's known as a fleet replacement squadron. Other air arms would typically call that an operational conversion unit. In other words, it's a squadron dedicated to type-specific training for new F-35C pilots. Now, the trademark manoeuvre of F-35 displays from all branches of the US military a high alpha tactical pitch. That F-35 is now joined by a second example, as well as an F8F Bearcat from Planes of Fame, for a legacy flight. This is an initiative which has been very much expanded over the last 5 years or so, more or less equivalent to the US Air Force's Heritage Flight programme. Indeed, the US Navy's airshow commitments as a whole have been substantially ramped up in recent years. In addition to the expanding of the Legacy Flight programme, we also have the relatively new Growler demo team formed in 2021, and this F-35 display, which was established in 2022. Well, up next, our first civilian contribution, the Red Bull Air Force. This display brings together Kirby Chambliss in the Edge 540 along with Aaron Fitzgerald in one of the Flying Bull's Bo 105s. And it's interesting to be able to make a fairly direct comparison here between this duo and their European counterpart, flown by Luc Gepiella in the Edge 540 and Felix Baumgartner in the Bo 105. We've already seen those two several times on airshow dispatches this year. For starters, the American version of this display has much more advanced formation and synchronised aerobatics, something we don't really see very much of from Baumgartner and Gepiella. The Bo 105 solo is not, perhaps, quite as compact or as low to the ground as its European counterpart though, and with much thinner and less vibrant smoke. The manoeuvres, however, are largely the same, a sequence of seemingly impossible aerobatics made possible by the entirely unique rotor system on this helicopter. Normally, rotor blades are connected to the hub with hinges. Those hinges absorb the flex and vibration of the blades in flight, but they would break under the high loads of aerobatics like these. The Bo 105 is different. It pioneered flexible composite blades bolted straight into a rigid monoblock rotor head. That removes the weak point at the hinge, with the blades themselves absorbing the aerodynamic forces instead. Then in comes Kirby Chambliss for a very high quality aerobatic performance indeed. This is a much higher performance version of the Edge 540 than we saw Luc Gepiella flying in Europe. He operates a fairly standard twin-seat Edge 540T, whereas this is a highly tuned single-seat aircraft used for many years on the Red Bull Air Race. Chambliss reckons there is at least a 10% performance gap between this and a twin-seat Edge. He's described the twin-seaters as a family truckster and a dog in the past. Chambliss participated in every season of the Red Bull Air Race from 2003 until 2019. He took 7 race wins, although none were more recent than 2008, and he won the championship title in 2004 and 2006. As well as air racing, Chambliss is also a very accomplished aerobatic pilot with 5 US National Aerobatic Championship titles to his name. He's also a former team captain of the United States aerobatic team. Now get ready for Kirby's trademark manoeuvre. A very abrupt, high alpha snap to the vertical, the Edge 540 version of a Cobra. A change of pace now with a C-130J-30 Hercules of the US Air Force conducting a really rather high and distant flypast. This is the stretched version of the C-130J, 4.5 metres longer than the standard Hercules. That gives capacity for 2 additional cargo pallets. It's actually a fairly rare sight in the United States because the US Air Force operates nearly 250 aircraft from the Hercules family, but only 17 of them feature this stretched fuselage. 8 of those lengthened C-130J-30s were effectively put out on offer by the US Air Force a few years ago. They invited several squadrons to submit bids for them. The 165th Airlift Squadron was the successful candidate. They received their first stretched aircraft in 2021 and they replace a far older and smaller fleet of C-130Hs. Something a bit closer and with a bit more stage presence now, Vicky Benzing in her Stearman. It's an aircraft we often refer to as a Boeing Stearman, although that's not entirely accurate. It was designed in the early 1930s by the Stearman Aircraft Company as the Model 75, but that manufacturer was later bought out by Boeing, and it was Boeing that produced the Model 75 in the greatest numbers. It was designed primarily as a training aircraft, hence the open cockpit. That was common doctrine at the time. Pilots would be trained in open cockpit aircraft because it was believed that if students could feel the effect of the wind on their face, they would better understand how their aircraft was handling. The aircraft has no inverted fuel system, so must remain under positive G at all times, or the engine will quit. Shortly though, she will demonstrate what happens if the engine does stall by briefly pushing negative G, and watch for a blip in the smoke and a burst of flame from the exhaust. There it is. Here's a pilot who's becoming a rare treat to see at an airshow, the legendary aerobatic ace Sha Tucker. Until 2018, he was one of the most prolific solo aerobatic pilots on the American airshow circuit, flying a highly modified Pit Special. He's since retired from that, allegedly with the intention of setting up a formation team of Gamebird GB1s. Sadly, that doesn't seem to have happened, and he's mostly disappeared from the airshow world. But this has been his home show for many years, so Tucker came out of retirement to perform in this 86D Texan. Another graduate of the Red Bull Air Race next, Michael Goulian, flying the most successful competition aerobatic aircraft in the world today, the Extra 330 SC. A former member of the US aerobatic team, Goulian is a one-time national aerobatic champion. He also competed in every season of the Red Bull Air Race bar one. He has 2 race wins to his name and a career best season end result of 3rd. That was in 2018. Kirby Chambliss is not a particular fan of the Extra 300 family. He said it felt pretty limiting and he didn't particularly get on with it. Well, that's obviously not true of Michael Goulian, who flies this aircraft at air shows around the country to a very high level, as you can see. It's also obviously not true of participants in the World Aerobatic Championships, where the Extra 330 SC is by far the most popular aircraft in the field and has won 6 out of the last 7 championship events. From 1 aircraft to 8, and it's time for the first of our 2 big military aerobatic teams, the Canadian Forces Snowbirds. Here pulling up into a quarter clover in what should be a 9-ship diamond formation. Sadly, 1 aircraft is missing. Lead solo Snowbird 9 was removed from the team in June, having been charged with sexual assault. Given that occurred mid-season, there's been no opportunity to tweak the display or the formation shapes to cover for his absence, so all the 8-ship formations and manoeuvres here are slightly lopsided, including this one of their trademark manoeuvres, the Canada Break. Of course, the loss of a lead solo means that the opposition passes aren't really opposition passes anymore, just solo flybys. It wasn't really the Snowbirds' day, because added to that problem, they also displayed much further away from the crowd than usual, and on the Saturday flew at a higher altitude than usual as well, for reasons that I personally am not aware of. All this definitely made it a much less impactful and immersive performance than it probably ought to have been.
The Snowbirds have existed since 1971 and have used the same aircraft type ever since then, making them by far the oldest jet aerobatic team to have never changed aircraft type. A distant second place goes to Patria Aguila, formed in 1985 and flying the C-101. Many of the individual airframes are more than 50 years old and are probably the oldest airframes used by any military aerobatic team globally. The Tutor has long been retired from all other roles with the Royal Canadian Air Force, but the Snowbirds jets have been the subject of repeated life extension programs, which, it is hoped, will enable them to keep flying with the team until 2030. That's 20 years beyond their initial recommended retirement date. The latest upgrades, which are currently underway, include the addition of glass cockpits and new avionics such as transponders and warning systems. The first of those upgraded aircraft was completed earlier this year, and the team expects to predominantly use upgraded aircraft for the 2024 season. The lag-back cross there, a 5-ship opposition brake. But not quite nailing it today. And here, a very interesting manoeuvre, an on-crowd vertical brake. The Snowbirds are one of only 2 aerobatic teams in the world to fly such a manoeuvre. The other is the Jupiter aerobatic team from Indonesia, whom we featured in our Airshow Dispatches episode from Lima earlier this year. There were some quite wonderful performances by Kent Pietsch in his Interstate Cadet. He performed 3 times throughout the day, and first up is his comedy routine, an effort to make the aircraft look as though it's out of control, even though it very much isn't. And to add to the spectacle, the aircraft sheds parts over the course of the performance. Note now the missing aileron, and later a spare tyre will be dropped from the cockpit. Kent Pietsch has been flying air shows since 1973, but this is reportedly his final season, and the California International Airshow will most likely be one of his very last airshow appearances. Now here is his dead stick act, starting from 6,000 feet and descending pretty rapidly by virtue of some very high energy aerobatics. And following that, we'll see some conventional power-on aerobatics. This performance and the next one really drive home a couple of key differences between air shows in the United States and back in Europe. This, for example, is a very good demonstration of the extremely high calibre of airshow performances available in the USA. It is simply impossible to imagine an interstate cadet being flown this low or with this much gusto at a European airshow. And the same goes for Vicky Benzing in her Stearman, which is streets ahead of any comparable European Stearman performer. That being said, when it comes to the more interesting aircraft, the Warbirds particularly, the absolute opposite is true. We'll see that demonstrated in a moment with a pair of P51 Mustangs. But first, Kent Pietsch's last action of the day, a truck-top landing. But now, the inverse of that disparity I just mentioned between air shows in Europe and North America, a pair of P51D Mustangs. And I hesitate to use the word display in this context because that feels very generous. Series of straight and level flypasts punctuated by 90-second gaps would be a more accurate description. Certainly nothing that showed off the character or capabilities of the Mustang to any real degree, and not a performance that you would be likely to see at most European air shows. But still lovely to see a pair of Mustangs that don't get out and about to many public events. They're named Little Sandra and Primo Branco. Last episode we saw the Blue Angels, a few moments ago we saw the Snowbirds. Well, now let's complete the set with the other North American military jet aerobatic team. It is, of course, the quite brilliant US Air Force Thunderbirds. 6 F-16CM-52CFs being flown in this display. That designation indicates that this is a Block 52 C model F-16 with CCIP avionic consolidation and conformal fuel tank compatibility, although the US Air Force doesn't actually use conformal fuel tanks. The Thunderbirds have 13 aircraft at their disposal, 10 of these single-seat C models and 3 twin-seat D models. There are a few modifications that make these specific aircraft non-standard though. The 20mm Gatling gun above the left wing root has been removed and replaced with a smoke oil tank, accompanied by a large weight to preserve the aircraft's weight and balance properties. That weight also helps to pressurise the aircraft's oil system to improve its resilience to inverted flight. Thunderbirds just use white smoke. They did experiment with coloured smoke in 2020 during the pandemic, but aside from being highly toxic and difficult to handle, coloured smoke and afterburning engines don't really go together very well. The exhaust gas temperature from these engines is too hot for the coloured dye to handle some of the time. There are a couple of teams who've just about made it work. For example, China's August the 1st and the Republic of Korea's Black Eagles, both of which we featured earlier this year, but the trade-off is very limited use of afterburner in the case of either of those teams. The mountains made for a fantastically photogenic backdrop here in Salinas, especially by mid-afternoon when the sun started to move around to the side. A sneak pass. I can't think of any team who does a better job of sneak passes nowadays. Although they're often thought of as being similar in style and having some very similar manoeuvres to the Blue Angels, there are a couple of big differences between the two teams. One of them we're seeing now. The Thunderbirds have a much more fluid approach to using the solos, with one of the soloists slotting in with a diamond to complete some lovely 5-ship manoeuvres over the course of the show. The Blue Angels stick much more rigidly to the 4+2 format, with just one single 5-ship manoeuvre in the entire routine. The other difference is that, following a substantial redesign of their show a couple of years ago, the Thunderbirds routine is now a good 10 minutes shorter than the Blue Angels, with much less noticeable gaps between each manoeuvre. Every single element of this show is executed with clinical precision. But it's not just a demonstration of pilot skill, it takes the F-16 right to the limit of its flight envelope. This high alpha pass is a very good example of that. The aircraft demonstrating about 26 degrees of alpha, right on the limit of what the flight control software will permit. Another of those 5-ship manoeuvres I was describing earlier, probably the most interesting individual formation shape flown by the Thunderbirds, known as Card 5. It's quite remarkable, the longevity of the F-16 as a design. 49 years old this year, but still at the height of its service career and very much in production. These Block 52 jets began rolling off the production line in 1991. They offer increased power and integration with substantially more weapon systems than the original F-16, as well as new radar, data link and navigation systems, among countless other improvements. The very latest F-16V, of which deliveries are currently underway, features some 4.5 generation technologies, such as large area displays in the cockpit, active electronically scanned array radar, and a new mission computer. the F-16 is very much an aircraft type that we will continue seeing at airshows for many years to come. But now we come towards the end of the Thunderbirds display. The final act of the California International Airshow 2023 and the final act of this series of airshow dispatches. And what a series it's been. 10 airshows in 7 nations, taking in the very best action that the world had to offer in 2023. Many of the aircraft and performances we've seen this year had never featured on airshow dispatches before. The French Navy's Hawkeye, German Eurofighter, Danish F-16, Japanese C-2, US Navy F-35, the Gazelle Squadron and Patrouille Tranchant, to name but a few. This year we filmed no fewer than 11 military jet aerobatic teams: the Thunderbirds, Snowbirds, Blue Angels, Red Arrows, Frecce Tricolori, Patrouille de France, Patrouille Suisse, Al-Fazan, Russian Knights, August the 1st, and the Black Eagles. We've seen some incredible formations: at Lima, the Friendship Flight; at Air Legends, the Me-262, Sabre and MiG-15, and at Pratica di Mare, the F-104 flying with the Sabre, F-2000 and F-35, and the G-91 flying with the Tornado and AMX. Many of the world's very best fast jet solo displays have featured this series, including the US Air Force Raptor, Finnish Hornet, Malaysian Su-30 and Belgian F-16. Plus, of course, the French Navy's exceptional Rafale M two-ship tactical demonstration. This year has brought forth some exceptional warbird action, a huge variety of former Italian types at the Aeronautica Militare Centenary Show in Rome, restored Mustangs at Air Legend, and the first French airshow appearance by a B-17 in many years. We've seen some new or updated displays like the Polish Air Force's C-130 Hercules solo at Leszno, the new PC-7 team routine, and the first ever M346 Bielik aerobatic display in Radom. But we've also seen several aircraft that may never perform at an airshow again, including the Royal Air Force's now retired Hercules and the soon-to-be-retired Polish Su-22 and MiG-29. And we brought you some exceptional one-off performances, not least the combined Typhoon Lancaster synchro pair and Lima Langkawi's unparalleled opening gambit. There's been some extraordinary night airshow action to enjoy, from a Su-22 dropping photo reconnaissance flares to the debut of Zelazny's new night show, and the final display season for Marek Choim in his Extra 330. And it wasn't just Marek Choim who was performing his final airshow season this year. It was, quite likely, our last season of airshow dispatches, at least our last here on This Is Flight. Over the last 6 years we've taken you to 60 airshows in 12 nations, and we've loved every second of it. Thank you to all of you for joining us on this journey, and from all of us at This Is Flight, goodbye for now.